Hiya, this is the Mennyms chapter 4. Let me just put my glasses on. The rat. The Mennyms had problems enough already that day without the dire news from across the world. There was Joshua's foot for a start, and all the complications that involved. For the past 5 years or more, Joshua had been night watchman at Sydenham's electrical warehouse on the other side of town. He always walked there, quickly, well muffled, with his head down and his whole body bent forcefully forward. The interview for this job had taken place on a freezing cold Friday afternoon in a badly lit and unheated gatehouse. His employer had barely looked at him. Joshua remembered the bald patch in the middle of the man's head as he bent over the desk, where a little pool of light shone on the letter of application Appleby had written. Joshua's cap had been well down over his brows. The collar of his thick overcoat had been turned up around his ears. He needn't have worried, though. Clarence Sydenham had just mumbled on about the duties and the wages, and then thrust the paper at him for his signature. Joshua had gripped the pen in his gloved hand and scribbled his name as quickly as he could. Clarence had switched off the table lamp and hurried out to make his getaway in his Ford Transit. At the time, Joshua had been delighted. Interviews were always a gamble. There'd been times when he'd seen the risk was too great and he'd turned away from premises much more inviting to mortal men, but far too public for ragdolls. The job was not well paid, but it was adequate, and it had many compensations in Joshua's eyes. He would sit all night in the little office, taking a walk around aisles of shelves once an hour or so. Then he'd be ready at 7 sharp, head down in the hood of his duffel coat, to mutter good morning to Charlie, who always arrived first, and to hand over the keys to him. "Quiet night?" Charlie would inquire in a routine way as he went to hang his coat on the coat stand in the corner of the office. "Very quiet," Joshua would reply to the back of Charlie's head. Then he would hurry out as if to catch a bus. But he didn't. He hastened head down, but watchful, along 3 miles of streets to his home. Public transport was too well lit and too confined for him to dare to use it. All was well till the Thursday before Albert Pond's letter arrived. On that Thursday night, Joshua had been at work as usual. He'd done several prowls to make sure there were no intruders. There never were. His movements around the building and the lights he switched on and off at irregular intervals must have been a sufficient deterrent. An automatic alarm system had recently been installed, but Joshua always turned it off as soon as he came in. Newfangled, unnecessary thing. He'd read the evening paper. He'd even clasped his hands round a mug of cocoa and made believe he was drinking it. Not that there was anyone to see him, but he liked the pretend. It relieved the monotony. Then he settled back in his chair for a little snooze. It was a nice old office, very functional, a couple of metal filing cabinets, a strong desk, a dim ceiling light with a white enamel shade, a thin carpet not quite covering all the floorboards, and with a that could trip anybody up frayed patch in front of the gas fire. Not a bad job, all considered. Then suddenly, as Joshua slept, disaster struck. Through the part-open glass door, from the warehouse floor, came a large and hungry rat. The metal boxes on the warehouse shelves had offered no sustenance. The rat sniffed around cautiously. Then he came under the old knee-hole desk to Joshua's boot. Placidly, but industriously, he began to gnaw at it. Then, finding the leather none too juicy, but feeling confident that no human being was about to attack him, the rat crawled further up Joshua's leg and ate right through his trousers, till bits of kapok began to flutter to the floor. Joshua woke from his catnap and, hearing scuffling around his knee, looked down and was horrified. As soon as he jumped up, the rat dived out into the darkness. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Rag dolls feel no pain. The wound, if you could call it that, did not hurt him. But he was, after all, a living being. Pain is of the flesh, but fear is of the mind. Joshua looked at his tattered knee and was terrified. The clock on the wall said 20 to 6. Joshua had just an hour and 20 minutes to get ready. It was not going to be easy, not one little bit. He looked hard at the knee with the stuffing falling out and the gnawed boot below it. Easy? It might not even be possible. 10 of his precious minutes were spent in paralysed fright. He had sat down heavily as soon as the rat fled. Now he didn't know whether he'd be able to rise again, let alone walk. "I'll have to do something," he said to himself at last. The first thing was to stop any more stuffing from falling out and to push back as much as he could. Opening the desk drawer, he found, to his relief, a roll of sticky tape. Another drawer obligingly supplied a pair of scissors. So, with as much skill as he could muster, he began to carry out an emergency repair. He wished Vinetta was here. She was much better at that sort of thing. After a great struggle, the leg had at least stopped shedding any more stuffing. It looked abnormal and ugly with the trouser leg hanging raggedly around it, but all that could be hidden by his duffel coat. The problem now was to find out if the leg could still manage to support his weight and to walk in a reasonable manner. Joshua stood up. That was all right. He held the desk with both hands and gingerly moved his good foot one step back. Then he tried to do the same thing with his bad foot. But instead of obediently joining its partner, the silly thing went off to one side. Joshua looked down at it unbelievingly. He knew where he had told the foot to go, and it hadn't gone there. With regard to standing, it made little difference. He still had both hands on the desk, and his feet, instead of being together, were spread astride. He looked sternly at his disobedient left limb and willed it to work its way towards its partner. That worked. He gave a half-hearted sigh of relief. Taking his hands from the desk, he stood upright and made a determined effort to reach the coat stand. The result was what can only be described as a funny walk, in classic funny walk style. The right foot trod firmly. The left one shot out in front before crashing down on a place on the floor about 6 inches ahead of where it should have been. This set the right foot slightly off balance, but Being a clever and orderly right foot, it soon learnt to correct its mate's eccentricity. I suppose I'll manage, thought Joshua bleakly, but it'll be a slow job. He looked at the clock and saw that it was 25 to 7. Quickly he put on his coat and went and stood in the doorway to wait for Charlie. It was a cold morning, so it didn't look too odd that Joshua was muffled up in his hood and that one of Tulip's scarves was wrapped right round his chin. "You're in a hurry this morning, old man," chaffed Charlie as Joshua hastily handed over the keys before the newcomer had even crossed the doorstep. "Full of colds," sniffed Joshua. "Begun to get home to bed." Charlie went in to hang his coat up, and Joshua took that opportunity to get his funny walk round the corner out of sight. Charlie turned round to make some other friendly remark and shrugged when he saw that the night watchman was already gone. "Odd bloke," he said to himself. "Seen him 5 mornings a week for years, yet I don't really know anything about him, or even that, for that matter, even what he looks like under all those clothes." Meanwhile, Joshua was off with his funny walk down the quiet back lanes and side streets on a journey that took him twice as long as usual and got more and more difficult as he drew near his home. People looked askance at him. The walk was by no means unobtrusive. Fortunately, the bulky figure in the big duffel coat did not look approachable. And equally fortunately, it was still a little too early for the children to be going to school. A paper boy did shout after him, "You'll never get to play for Accrington Stanley, mister." Apart from that, he was unmolested. When he got to Brocklehurst Grove, he became more worried. It must have been about 8:30. He saw from the corner a car gliding out of the drive at number 1. After it passed, he walked cautiously by the high hedge, brushing the twigs with his shoulder, trying desperately hard to be invisible. At number 2, all of the curtains were still closed, and the door looked firmly shut. Number 3 was the worst. 4 snooty children in assorted school uniforms were scrambling noisily into the family car. "At least I've done my homework," shrieked one of them in a voice that carried to the street. "I'm not a lazy beggar like you." "Get in," said their father, "and shut up." Car doors slammed. Joshua froze. Any minute, the car with its menagerie would swing out into the street. It would pass close to him. Those awful children would see his funny walk and jeer. And he couldn't just stand still. That would look suspicious. In an agony of suspense, he gingerly bent his good leg and spent what seemed like forever unfastening and then carefully refastening his bootlace. The car passed by. Joshua stood up, ready to walk on, but the left leg shot forward before the right one was properly balanced. Down he fell on his bottom on the pavement, his mittened hands shooting behind him to stop him falling further. 2 of the children in the back of the car saw this and pointed and giggled, but the car with the objectionable youngsters was soon out of sight. From behind the net curtains in her front bedroom window, Mrs. Jarman at number 4 saw Joshua fall. She knew him vaguely by sight, the shape of him anyway. If he had not got straight up, she would have gone down to see if he needed help. As he disappeared behind her hedge, she had a glimpse of the funny walk, but put it down to the awkwardness after his fall and thought no more about it. The Mennyms were known to keep themselves to themselves. Well, let them. Vinetta was already at the front door, looking out for him, when she saw his funny walk coming up the drive. She pursed her lips in annoyance. "What do you think you're playing at? Do you want everyone looking at you?" she snapped. "Where on earth have you been all this time?" As he drew closer and she saw the misery on his face, she realised that something was really wrong. She ran to him and supported him on her shoulder into the house. That's the end of chapter 4.